Hello, this is Funk McLovin, back again with another lecture-style video about another topic that I wanted to connect to Deltarune, and that is the concept of absurdism. Last time I talked about Gnosticism in Deltarune, which is I'll call it a pseudo-religious philosophy, but this is a more direct philosophy, and I want to talk about its connections to Deltarune because I find them very interesting, and I think they will be thematic as Deltarune continues. And it can be summed up in one central phrase that Deltarune keeps repeating. No one can choose who they are in this world. This is true, of course, in Deltarune, but it is also true in our real world. Keep this in mind moving forward. First, let's talk about absurdism. Absurdism is a semi-modern philosophical movement that has many offshoots and broadly comes from or is a reaction to existentialism. It's often lumped in with existentialism, but I see the two as very different. And Albert Camus, who's the person who is the father of absurdism, it would agree with me there. He doesn't like to be lumped in with the existentialists. Or should I say, he would not have liked. He's passed away now. The two central works of absurdism are The Myth of Sisyphus, which is an essay, and that's where we get the phrase, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy," which was recently a meme, as well as the novel L'étranger, or The Stranger. His work concerns itself with the absurd, or the struggle with the meaninglessness of life, a sort of response to nihilism. The existentialists like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were both very, very concerned with nihilism and considered them to be one of the most harmful things you could do. The nihilists embraced nihilism as a kind of negative philosophy, but Camus wants to flip this around. He wants to say, well, what are the good implications of nihilism? I also wrote connections to Gnosticism. There are a lot of connections between absurdism and Gnosticism, which was the subject of my previous video. And the main one is that the universe is indifferent to our own struggles, so keep that in mind moving forward. The two main works are The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger, as I discussed. The Myth of Sisyphus has themes of struggle and pointlessness. Let's go over the Myth of Sisyphus as a myth first. The Myth of Sisyphus is concerned with the actual story of Sisyphus, and Sisyphus was a Grecian king who fooled the underworld, and as such, when he died, he was subjected to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity, and when the boulder reached the top of the hill, it would roll back down. It was essentially a pointless task that he had to do forever, which underlined the pointlessness of him trying to avoid death. And normally, the reaction to this story is one of kind of a parable, kind of a fable perhaps, about the pointlessness of trying to outrun death, being as pointless as Sisyphus rolling the boulder up a hill. But Camus comes along and he says, no, the pointlessness of Sisyphus is to his credit. He has a goal in life, he has a purpose, and that is something that we as humans actually quite like. If we have a purpose in life, then we are happy. And Sisyphus has a purpose in life, ergo he is happy. Now, there's more to it than that. That's just the basic overview. The Stranger is a story about a man who essentially commits a murder and does not care. He is shown throughout the work to be indifferent to his mother's death, to his fiance's cares about wanting to be married, and ultimately he murders a man because the man was like shining the sun into his eyes using the blade of a knife. And Camus writes about this absurd hero in a sympathetic way. It sounds like someone who we would not relate to whatsoever, but in the end of the story, the man is in jail and he is enjoying the simple pleasure of looking up out of his jail cell at the moon. Now again, these are stories that are a little bit impenetrable, and you might remember reading The Stranger from high school, maybe a literature class, maybe in college, and not really knowing what to make of it. But I want to get into more of that here. There are other pieces of absurdist fiction that focus on the strangeness and absurdism of the world, the craziness, the chaos, and how people deal with that. The most well-known of them is probably Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. That one is another one you read in school about Gregor Samsa. He wakes up as a bug. The Discworld series is something that's close to my heart. Philip K. Dick's stories. There's a movie, actually, I think it's still free on YouTube. You can watch A Scanner Darkly, which is a Keanu Reeves movie. It's just a mind fuck. It's a really good movie. There's Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22. Again, the Catch-22 series with George Clooney is excellent. There's the Coen brothers with the films Fargo and The Big Lebowski. The Big Lebowski is sort of seen as a modern-day absurdist masterpiece. And then, of course, there's David Lynch, who did Twin Peaks and Inland Empire. He has other works that are less absurdist, like Dune, but Twin Peaks is incredibly good as an absurdist piece of fiction. So let's talk about what the absurd is. Let's bring this all together. The absurd is the absurdness of the universe. It is the central conflict in human beings that says, I'm a human being. I want to search for meaning. My mind is created to search for meanings in the world, and the universe has given me none. The universe has not given me a meaning. It has not given me a reason to live. And if it has given me a reason to live, it is very difficult to find. Ergo, we live in an absurd world where we, as humans, want to find meaning, and the universe offers us none. The universe is this massive black blanket of nothingness that is covering up our lives. It is like a candle trying to make sense of the ocean before it gets extinguished. It is quite impossible. The absurd is not bad, strictly speaking. If you are an existentialist or a nihilist, the absurd would strike you as bad. But while the universe is uncaring and we live fleeting lives within it, we search for meaning, and that actually does make us feel pretty good. And you can live a good life even though the world is quite absurd. So what does that mean for us? We have to accept the absurd. We have to accept the fact that there is a meaningless universe, and really accept that that gives us a great deal of freedom. Let me talk to you about a little thought experiment. Let's say that tomorrow God came down from heaven and he said, the meaning of life is for human beings to make plastic. Is to make plastic. And that is what humanity is leading up to. That is what the Earth's purpose is, to make plastic. And you can substitute making plastic with any other act. You know, the meaning of life is to shake hands. The meaning of life is to love your neighbor. The meaning of life is to, kill each other and start wars. Whatever the meaning of life is, someone is going to be dissatisfied with that meaning of life. In other words, if the meaning of life, God says, is to kill people and start wars, well, I actually don't like war, and I think that's pretty bad. Or maybe the meaning of life is to love other people. Well, maybe I don't like other people. Maybe I actually quite hate certain people. There is some time or some way that the meaning of life is going to be disappointing. There is no answer for the meaning of life that is satisfying. And so, if you are an absurdist, you can say, well, if there is no meaning of life, well, I can just make one. I can substitute anything. I can put anything in that personally satisfies me. And you can slot that in. Your purpose in life can be anything. It can be anything, no matter how deep, no matter how shallow. And a lot of people consider this to be quite offensive, in fact. They see it as a little bit solipsistic. They see it as quite hedonistic. And they see it as essentially nihilist. And a lot of people buck against absurdism for this reason. But I don't really think that you can come up with any other explanation. There are a lot of people who want to impose a kind of universal morality on the world that I don't think really works. Any kind of morality that you try to impose on the world is going to have edge cases that invalidate them. For example, let's take the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. That seems like a very easy commandment to follow. When you're walking around in your life, you probably don't want to kill people. Like, very few people, I would say in most people's lives, they don't experience this at all. Very few people want to kill somebody. Even a soldier in war would probably not kill somebody if they had the option to. If you want to kill people, you are probably very mentally deranged in some way, in like a clinical sense. But there are times in your life where you can think of would be perfectly moral to kill somebody. Let's say they're threatening your family. Let's say they're trying to mug you in the street. Let's say they broke into your house. Let's say they kicked a puppy off a cliff. They looked you dead in the eyes and said, "I'm going to kick more puppies if you don't stop me." These are all moral ways to commit a murder. And so you can see that any kind of very strict moral system breaks down under the barest scrutiny. And absurdism is not necessarily a moral system. It's not a moral philosophy, but a lot of people who object to it are moralists, as it were. So that is the overview of the absurd. There are going to be more examples of it down the line. We're going to get deeper into it, but I think you have a baseline understanding. So whether you agree with the absurd or not, I think there are themes of absurdism in Deltarune that are worth thinking about. So even if you think to yourself, the absurd is stupid, Albert Camus is a hack, and Funk McLovin is a fraud, I think that there are still things to be drawn from Deltarune itself, so I hope you bear with me. Absurdism in Deltarune. The first piece of absurdism I see is the illusion of choice. There are many reasons to think that Deltarune is an absurd work, and I think this is number one. There are so many people in Deltarune trying to tell you that everything is predestined. From the prophecy to Ralsei to basically everybody in the church. Everyone wants you to believe that choice does not matter, that things are predestined. Susie says it in the beginning of the game. The prophecy says it. Ralsei says it. And we as players, we know this is true because we're playing a video game, and any video game has predetermined choices that you can undertake. So this is true. However, it kind of doesn't matter. It does not matter that there are no choices, and it is sometimes untrue in a practical sense. Whereas we might not have a choice in that Toby Fox has already decided what is going to happen in the game, but we do have choices in significant ways. We have choices of how we can react to things, we have choices how we can understand things, and we have certain choices that we can make in the story, such as going through the weird route, or the Snowgrave route as it's sometimes known. Now, where these choices are going to go remains to be seen, but I have a little theory here about where the story is going to go. The prophecy is something that we don't really like in Deltarune. In Chapter 4, Susie bucks against the prophecy, and Gerson bucks against the prophecy, and we're meant to understand that as good, a good instinct. However, the only time we are able to kind of get off the beaten trail is in the weird route. And the weird route is much, much worse than the normal route. So the only way that we are able to resist predetermination is through essentially the weird route, which sucks. So Deltarune is setting us up with this idea that we can circumvent predestination, but it is not to our benefit. And I don't know where this is going to go in the story, but I think it's something that we need to think about moving on. The second is I want to talk about Kris as Sisyphus, and I have another slide later about this, but this is the broad strokes. The player is like Sisyphus, rolling that boulder up a hill. We must imagine the player smiling. Deltarune is a video game. All video games are by definition pointless. You cannot bring any resource from the video game except your experiences into the real world. And as experiences, they're quite shallow. Now, does that mean they're pointless? Absolutely not. I think that would be foolish to say. I think, video games are pieces of art that we are meant to interpret, and the interpretation of them is kind of the point. So even though we are undergoing a pointless endeavor, we are rolling the boulder up the hill, as we say, we are still experiencing something. We are still experiencing art, we are still participating in the game, and that is a joy to us. That is fun, even though it is ultimately pointless. We also must imagine that Sisyphus is a little bit defiant. In other words, he has an antagonistic relationship with his boulder. And we have an antagonistic relationship with most video games. In other words, when you are playing a video game, you want to get something out of them. Even the most peaceful of video games like Stardew Valley resist you a little bit. You have to undergo certain tasks to get to the end of a video game. There are no video games where you can just press A, press A, press A to get to the end. It's not a book. There are visual novels, but even those require you to make certain choices. So you are in defiance of a video game in some small way, and that makes even more meaning come out of it. Next, we're going to talk about the rejection of meaning. I got into this on the first slide, but the meaning structure is something that offers meaning to its constituents. In The Stranger, the main character rejects marriage, for example, as something that is a pointless meaning structure. There are a lot of meaning structures in Undertale, such as the prophecy, which I already mentioned, and the church, which is a source of community for its constituents, but they are kind of shallow. Like, the church, if you've gone to church yourself in the last, probably 100 years, you know that church kind of sucks. And it requires a lot to get people invested in church because, unlike the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages, the church is no longer a source of great authority. Kierkegaard talks about this. The rationalists talk about this. There was kind of a uprising against the church in the what so-called Enlightenment. And Nietzsche summed this up by saying, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, etc. You know the quote. And what he means by this is, the old system of meaning is dead. And Camus takes this a step further. Camus says, there are no systems of meaning that have any inherent value. This is part of the absurd. We are struggling against the universe. We must make our own meaning systems, but inevitably they are going to be pointless. And the meaning systems in Deltarune seem to bring the people together quite a bit, but they're also a little bit, shall we say, illusory. For instance, the people in the church seem to understand to some extent the prophecy, but they don't know what it means, and they have no claim over its fate. Finally, we'll talk about existential tension. This is most notable in the secret bosses, or all the characters who have the freedom motif. Characters who are looking for freedom. In the first two chapters, we have Jevil and Spamton. Jevil and Spamton are both reacting to meaninglessness. Jevil is reacting to meaninglessness by essentially lashing out and seeking chaos. He realizes nothing matters, and he strikes out. He's like, fuck everybody then. Spamton, he sees the meaninglessness of the world, and his reaction is basically the opposite. He wants to impose meaning on the world. He wants to reach heaven. I talked about this in my Gnosticism video, so I won't go over it too much. Now let's compare Gerson and the Knight. The Knight, we're not really sure what they're up to right now. The Knight is just kind of a mysterious figure, but they are working against the player in some extent. And especially if you fight them in Chapter 4, it's a very difficult fight. Now, Gerson is someone who wants to avoid the world that the Knight wants to bring around. He wants to avoid the prophecy altogether. And so, in his way, his boulder that he is pushing, which might be meaningless because he's dead, is that yes, I want to fight against fate, but I want to fight against it on my own terms. I don't want to fight against it in terms of the prophecy. Now, how this all shakes out is going to come up in later chapters, as you know, but just understand that these characters are trying to find freedom in an absurd world. Finally, absurdism as like a literary device. It is the tendency for a work to resist interpretation. Deltarune leaves a lot of threads hanging, not only because it is a incomplete work, but because I think Toby Fox likes incomplete threads. My evidence for this is the W.D. Gaster stuff in the previous game. That was a lot of open threads. But everyone in the game who is worth anything rejects interpretation. In other words, Gerson rejects interpretation through the prophecy, which I've already discussed. The player rejects interpretation by continuing to play a game to find out what happens, even though they don't entirely know what's going on. Especially if you don't participate in the secret stuff. If you just continue through the game like normal, you're basically continuing through a game where you don't have all the pieces. You don't know the motivations of your enemies. You don't really even know the motivations of your friends. Ralsei is a complete black box. Kris is like weird. There's something going on with them. But in spite of this meaninglessness and difficulty understanding the story, we continue. And then there's the theory crafting that exists in the community, which is a way for everybody to kind of collaboratively come together and try to figure things out. And a lot of people in the community disagree on these theories. I even made a video about W.D. Gaster where I disagreed with certain things in those theories. And this kind of fluid meaning in Deltarune and Undertale is very important to its themes. In other words, the meaning of the works depends on who is looking at it. All right, here's a little intermission for you folks. How are you feeling? I'm feeling pretty good. I'm gonna keep going if that's okay with you. But I just wanted to check in. So glad you're doing okay. So let's compare the actual Albert Camus' works against Deltarune, because I think there are some interesting parallels. First of all is Kris as the Stranger. I talked about this briefly before. The Stranger features a main character named Mersault. I don't know if that's how you say it. I'm not a fucking French frog. But Kris has a lot of overlap with the Stranger. Kris consistently is seen doing things that could be thought of as hedonistic. Whenever Kris gets free of the soul, Kris is doing something indulgent, such as drinking chocolate milk. They they open their own fountain. They in the first chapter, there's a fake out where they have a big knife and they grin at the camera, but it turns out that they're actually just eating the pie that Toriel made. So Kris is kind of this very id-led person, and they have a lot of impulses to do things on a whim, which is very much in line with the Stranger of The Stranger. The Stranger, he does things on whims all the time, and this does lead him to be killed and executed for crimes, but at the same time, he does succeed in every goal that he has. With his girlfriend, he tells her when she offers to get married, he says, "I'll get married with you, it doesn't matter to me." And a lot of people interpret that to mean, okay, he doesn't care about marriage. But I disagree. I think he's saying, hey, marriage doesn't matter, but if it would make you happy, I will participate in it with you. Much the same, Kris understands that it's imperative to cooperate with the story, but also doesn't seem to take it very seriously. When Kris tosses you into the gift box in Chapter 4, they just go drink chocolate milk. And they are trying to stop you from seeing what's on the guitar, but chocolate milk seems like their fucking priority here. And I kind of like that. There's also a rejection of morality. In The Stranger, we're meant to understand the protagonist as kind of morally neutral, even though he is a murderer. And we're supposed to relate to them, if not, support their actions. And in Deltarune, and even I would argue in Undertale, there are some horrible things that people do that you're just meant to kind of forgive automatically. Like Susie threatens you very, very scarily in Chapter 1, but still we are meant to understand Susie as good. We understand that Kris might have a violent past with the things that were uncovered in Chapter 4, but at the same time, Kris is the protagonist, and we kind of support them in some way. So morality is kind of out the door. There's also the issue with, unlike in Undertale, Deltarune does not have a system of morality. In other words, if you kill all the Darkners, all that happens is your castle town is not filled up. And this is interesting to me because it seems like Toby Fox is judging your gameplay in the same way as Undertale, but seems to be taking it much less seriously than Undertale. In other words, in Undertale, if you killed everybody, you got the genocide route. You essentially got punished. But in Deltarune, if you kill everybody, that's just an accepted gameplay outcome. And I find that interesting. Next, let's compare Deltarune to the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus is concerned with a search for meaning. In other words, at the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, there's a famous quote, "The only important philosophical concept is suicide." And what Camus means by this is, let's say God is dead and we have killed him. Well, if we can't construct a meaning in our world anymore, I don't want to be blunt here, but why don't we just kill ourselves? And the reason is kind of twofold. The first reason is because we have a survival instinct and we don't want to do that. But the second reason is because even in a meaningless world, it's kind of easy to construct meaning. In Deltarune, through chapters 1 through 4, here's a question for you. What do they do? What do they actually accomplish? They manage to undo 4 dark fountains. I guess they managed to close 5 dark fountains, I guess, technically. But what do they do? Are they any closer to, like, stopping the roaring? Are they any closer to knowing what the night is doing? Not really. They don't even know how to open the bunker yet. They have confronted the night, but the night has consistently shown that they're able to defeat the protagonists. So what is the point? What has been accomplished? And the answer is nothing. Basically nothing. We don't know yet. And I'm sure that we will accomplish something before the game is over, but 4 entire chapters before you accomplish anything at all is pretty significant. And the reason that we are still compelled to complete the game is because of this progress in spite of meaning. We get along with the characters in this story, even if the story kind of is unclear of where it's going. And so we want to continue, basically for the sake of continuing, for the sake of our friends in the story. I find that very fascinating. The next part of Sisyphus that is emphasized is repetition. Obviously, in the story of Sisyphus, he lifts the boulder up the hill for eternity. He does it over and over and over again. And this is very stultifying, obviously, but repeating pointless tasks is actually a very important part of life. Your routine is something that gives you a lot of comfort. Especially if you have some kind of neurodivergence, you know how important a routine is. Doing something at the same time every day, doing the same order of tasks, having an idea of what you're supposed to be doing. This idea of a routine gives your life meaning. And this routine also gives Sisyphus meaning. Now, the fact that I'm comparing your daily routine to Sisyphus might be a little strange and weird to you, but I think that fundamentally they are both good in the same way. The definition of insanity, as we know, is to do something over and over expecting a different result. However, I think that on top of not being like the actual definition of insanity, clinically speaking, I think that doing something over and over expecting a different result often actually does, in this chaotic world, yield different results. For instance, I was having trouble with my Wi-Fi box, and something that helps is if you unplug it and plug it back in. And I don't know much about my Wi-Fi box, so all I did was kept plugging it and plugging it back in, and eventually it did start to work, even though I wasn't really changing what I was doing. Or repetition can also result in positive outcomes by essentially building up something. There's a friend of mine in my real life who has trust issues. And I've said over and over, you can trust me, you can trust me. And even though I'm doing the same input, the output is different. In that proving they can trust me now makes them trust me. So I'm doing the same things, and I'm getting different results. And the repetition of this, it shows that basically pointless tasks, like rolling the boulder, are not pointless tasks. Imagine if you were actually rolling that boulder up the hill. You would very quickly begin to understand the hill, understand the concepts of rolling. You would get an appreciation for rolling. You might even value, like, hey, maybe I can get the boulder up in a shorter amount of time. And it would be very difficult to do that task for that long without deriving some kind of meaning from it. In the game Hades, for instance, Sisyphus and his boulder have a very close relationship. He calls him Boldy. I think that's very important. And then finally, in the myth of Sisyphus, the idea of freedom within prisons. At the end of The Stranger, the main character is in prison, and he's looking out at the sky. And this brings him a great deal of joy. And inside of a prison, you can still have a good time. Even if things are very horrible, you are still in charge of your own life in some small way. And there really isn't a big difference between being in prison and being free in that way. Because really, the universe, if it is as horrible as I've said it is up till this point, if it is as indifferent and as absurd, then what is the difference between sitting around in your house, not having any money to go anywhere because you're waiting for your paycheck, and being in actual prison? Or perhaps in a more functional way, what is the difference in your freedom? You're not free right now. You have to go to work and get a paycheck. You have to find a way to make money in the world. You're not free if you lived in the fucking woods. You would have to hunt your own food and kill other beings to, like, survive. So you have to find freedom within the prison. There's a story. This is a Buddhist story, but I'm going to kind of co-opt it into this idea of absurdism. It's called The Tiger and the Strawberry. It was in King of the Hill. You might know it. It's like a meme right now, I think. But The Tiger and the Strawberry goes like this. A man's being chased by a tiger, and he is run off a cliff, and he falls, and at the last minute, he catches a branch, and he hangs from it by one hand. And he looks up, and there's the tiger waiting to kill him at the top of the cliff. And he looks down, and there's another tiger at the bottom of the cliff waiting to eat him. So he knows, in his heart, he is going to die. And on the branch, he sees a flash of red, the juiciest wild strawberry he has ever seen. He takes his left hand that's not holding the branch, he reaches out and he plucks it, and he pops it into his mouth. And it's the most delicious thing that he's ever tasted. Now, the meaning of that story, I think, is essentially a little bow that wraps up all the points that I've been trying to make in this video about inevitability, about finding joy in everything, and about essentially making your own meaning and making your own pleasure in the world. So I'm not going to go out of my way to explain it in depth, in detail, but that's all I got. No one can choose who they are in this world, but what are you able to choose in this world? What choices are you able to make? And much like Kris, when you free yourself from a stifling reality, what are you going to do? Well, you can make some delicious chocolate milk. Alright, that's all I got. I'm going to go back to the slide where let's see here, other absurdist fiction, in case you wanted to check anything out. But absurdism is a philosophy that I've held very close to my heart over the years. And if you like this video, or liked absurdism, make sure to leave a comment about what kind of philosophy you'd like me to talk about next. Make sure to go to my Patreon, My Patreon is something I've been trying to put more effort into. I have a blog on there that you can see. There's a lot of snippets that I post of these videos, and I don't know. It's just, you're supporting someone who's trying to get more serious about YouTube, and so if you want to be a part of that, go to my Patreon. Liking, commenting, and subscribing also helps me. It would also greatly help me if you tickled my butthole and kissed your dad. So if you could do those things for me, I would really appreciate it. It would mean a lot to me. And I'll see you in the next video, which is the next video I've got a poll on my YouTube posts page that you can vote on. So I don't know, just I'm excited to talk about more of these concepts, and pretty soon I'm gonna get back into like Undertale stuff, like the I did some videos about Undyne, and I want to do one about Asgore and like his morality, like a study of Asgore's morality in Undertale. But yeah, all this is to say, I hope that you have enjoyed so far. I really do value, I read every comment, so if you make a comment about something, I'd really love to see what you have to say about my work. That's all I got to say. I don't know how to end the videos, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a weird sound and then shut off the recording.